The frozen creek water lapped at her motionless body like death, whispering a final invitation. And Kyle Ramsey thought at first she was already gone until her pale fingers twitched once against the ice. Kyle had been riding for 3 days straight across the Dakota territory, heading back to his small ranch outside Fargo after selling his cattle in Bismarck. The winter of 1878 had come early and merciless, blanketing the plains in snow and ice that made every journey treacherous. His horse, a sturdy roan named Copper, had been the one to notice something wrong, ears flicking nervously toward the partially frozen creek that cut through the sparse woodland. At first, Kyle had dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer that had broken through thin ice. But something made him dismount and investigate, and that was when he saw her. A woman, young from what he could tell, lying half in the shallow water where the creek had not yet frozen solid. Her dark hair spread around her like ink on white paper, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that made Kyle's heart hammer with urgency. He rushed down the embankment, his boots sliding on the icy rocks, and pulled her from the water. She was light, too light, and soaked through completely. Her clothes were simple, a worn cotton dress that offered no protection against the brutal cold, and no coat anywhere in sight. Kyle laid her on the snowy bank and pressed his ear to her chest, relief flooding through him when he heard the faint but steady rhythm of her heart. "Miss, can you hear me?" He patted her cheek gently, then more firmly. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. There was no time to waste. Hypothermia would kill her within the hour if he did not act fast. Kyle gathered her in his arms and carried her up to where Copper waited. The horse shifted nervously as Kyle draped the woman across the saddle, then mounted behind her, holding her against his chest. His ranch was still 2 hours away, maybe more in this weather. He wrapped his heavy coat around both of them as best he could and urged Copper into a steady trot, the fastest pace he dared risk on the icy ground. The ride seemed endless. Kyle kept one arm locked around the woman's waist, keeping her upright, while his other hand held the reins. He talked to her the whole way, nonsense mostly, just willing her to hold on. Her skin was like ice against his, and he could feel her shivering, which he took as a good sign. Shivering meant her body was still fighting. "Stay with me now," he said into her wet hair. "Not much farther. Got a warm fire waiting, hot coffee, blankets. You just stay with me." When his ranch finally came into view, a modest cabin with a small barn beside it, Kyle had never been more grateful to see home. He dismounted carefully, pulling the woman down into his arms again, and kicked the cabin door open. The fire he had banked before leaving 3 days ago had died to cold ashes, and he cursed under his breath. Kyle laid the woman on his bed, the only bed in the single-room cabin, and immediately set about building a fire in the stone hearth. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, shaving kindling, stacking logs, coaxing flame from flint and steel. Once the fire caught and began to crackle, spreading warmth into the cold room, he turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. Her wet clothes had to come off. Kyle hesitated, propriety warring with necessity, but necessity won quickly. He had seen death from exposure before, and he would not let this woman die from his squeamishness. He worked carefully, removing her sodden dress, her undergarments, averting his eyes as much as possible while still doing what needed to be done. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, tucking them around her, then added his winter quilt on top. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, talking to her all the while. "Come on now, wake up for me. You are safe here. No one is going to hurt you." It was another hour before her eyes finally opened. They were green, he noticed, a striking pale green like new grass in spring, and they looked at him with confusion and fear. Easy, Kyle said, holding up his hands. You are safe. I found you in the creek. Do you remember what happened? She blinked slowly, her gaze traveling around the cabin, taking in the rough wooden walls, the simple furnishings, the fire crackling in the hearth. When her eyes returned to him, they filled with tears. I thought I was dead, she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. Nearly were, Kyle said gently. What is your name? How did you end up in that water? She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she had lost consciousness again, but then she spoke. Natalie Turner. I am Kyle Ramsey. This is my ranch about 10 miles west of Fargo. Can you tell me what happened to you? Natalie's hands emerged from the blankets, and she looked at them as though surprised to find them still attached to her body. I was traveling with a wagon train. We were trying to reach Fargo before the worst of the winter set in. There was an accident. The wagon I was in went off the trail down an embankment. I remember hitting the water and it was so cold. The others. Her voice broke. I heard them calling for a while, but then nothing. I tried to climb out, but I was so cold and everything was spinning. When was this? Yesterday morning, I think. Or maybe the day before. I do not know. I walked for a long time, or maybe I fell. Everything blurs together. Kyle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had been out there for at least a day, probably longer. The others in your wagon, were they family? She shook her head. Just other travelers. I was going to Fargo to work. There was a position as a teacher. I had a letter. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. It is gone now. Everything is gone. Rest now, Kyle said. We will sort things out once you are stronger. You need food and warmth. I will make something hot to eat. He moved to the small kitchen area, really just a corner of the cabin with a cast iron stove and some shelves. He had supplies, thank God, and he set about making a simple broth with dried beef and vegetables. While it heated, he hung Natalie's wet clothes by the fire, trying not to think too hard about the intimacy of the situation. He had a woman in his bed, naked under his blankets, and here he was playing nursemaid and cook. Kyle had been alone for 3 years now, ever since his wife Mary had died in childbirth along with their son. He had thought his heart had frozen solid after that, as frozen as the Dakota winter. He had stopped going to town socials, stopped accepting dinner invitations from well-meaning neighbors, stopped thinking about anything beyond his cattle and his solitude. Now here was this woman, dropped literally at his feet by fate or chance or God, and he did not know what to make of it. When the broth was ready, he brought a bowl to the bedside. Natalie had dozed off again, but she woke when he touched her shoulder. He helped her sit up, keeping the blankets tucked around her, and fed her small spoonfuls. She ate slowly at first, then with more hunger and color began to return to her cheeks. Thank you, she said when the bowl was empty. You saved my life. Could not very well leave you there, Kyle said gruffly, embarrassed by her gratitude. Some men would have. He had no answer to that, so he just took the bowl and returned it to the kitchen. When he came back, Natalie was looking at him with those green eyes, and he felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking up on a spring river. I have nowhere else to go this winter, she said quietly. The wagon train is gone. My money was in my bag, which went into the creek. I have nothing, no one. I was supposed to start teaching in January, but without my letter of introduction, they probably will not even see me. Kyle rubbed his jaw, feeling the several days' growth of beard there. Winter is just starting. Travel is impossible now, will be for months. You are welcome to stay here until spring. I have supplies enough for 2 and I can hunt if needed. I cannot impose on you like that. You will die if you leave. That is not an imposition, that is just fact. He said it more harshly than he intended, and he saw her flinch. He softened his tone. Look, Miss Turner, I am not going to pretend this is not an unusual situation. "It is, but I am a decent man and I will not turn you out to freeze. Come spring, I will take you into Fargo myself, help you get that teaching position or whatever else you need. Until then, you stay here, you heal up, and we make the best of it." "Agreed." Natalie studied him for a long moment, and he wondered what she saw. He was 30 years old, weathered by sun and wind, his brown hair always too long, his hands rough from work. He had been told once he had kind eyes, but that was a long time ago. "Agreed," she finally said, "but I will not be a burden. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need. I will earn my keep." "Fair enough. Now rest. You have been through hell and your body needs time to recover." Over the next few days, Natalie did recover, slowly but steadily. The first day she mostly slept, waking only to eat the soup and bread Kyle prepared. The second day she was able to sit up for longer periods, and Kyle gave her one of his shirts and a pair of his smaller trousers to wear, cinched tight with a belt, since her own clothes, even after drying, were torn and ruined beyond repair. "I look ridiculous," she said, standing in the middle of the cabin in his oversized clothes, but she was smiling, and Kyle found himself smiling back. "You look warm," he said. "That is what matters." By the third day, she insisted on helping with chores. Kyle protested, but she was stubborn, and he found he liked that about her. She made coffee that was actually drinkable, unlike his own bitter brew, and she could make even his meager supplies into meals that tasted like something worth eating. They fell into a routine. Kyle would wake early, start the fire, and go out to tend to Copper and the 3 cows he kept for milk. When he came back in, stamping snow from his boots, Natalie would have breakfast ready. They would eat together at the small wooden table, making awkward small talk at first, but gradually finding an easier rhythm. She told him about her life before the wagon train. She had been raised in Ohio in an orphanage run by nuns. She had learned to read and write there, had even been allowed to help teach the younger children, which had given her the idea to become a teacher herself. When she turned 21 that past summer, the nuns had helped her secure the position in Fargo, a fresh start in a new territory. "I wanted adventure," she said with a rueful laugh. "I wanted to see something beyond those orphanage walls. I suppose I got more adventure than I bargained for." Kyle told her about his ranch, about the hard work of building it from nothing, about the cattle he ran on the open range. He did not talk about Mary, not at first. That wound was still too raw, even after 3 years. The days grew shorter and colder. Snow fell almost constantly, piling in drifts around the cabin, and Kyle was grateful he had stocked the woodshed full before leaving for Bismarck. He taught Natalie how to milk the cows, how to collect eggs from the few chickens he kept in the barn. She learned quickly, her hands becoming more confident with each task. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire. Kyle had a few books, and Natalie would read aloud while he whittled or mended tack. Her voice was soothing, and he found himself looking forward to these quiet hours more than he wanted to admit. One night, about 2 weeks after he had found her, a blizzard hit with a fury that shook the cabin walls. The wind howled like a living thing, and snow blew in through every tiny crack. Kyle stuffed rags into the gaps while Natalie piled more wood on the fire. They pushed the bed closer to the hearth and hung blankets to create a smaller space to heat. "We will be fine," Kyle assured her, seeing the fear in her eyes. "This cabin has weathered worse." They sat up late, neither wanting to sleep while the storm raged. Kyle found himself telling her about Mary, about how they had met at a church social in town, about their wedding and their dreams of building a family. Natalie listened without interruption, her hand finding his at some point, her fingers warm and steady. "I am sorry," she said when he finished. "That is a terrible loss." "It was, is," Kyle looked down at their joined hands. I thought I would be alone forever, thought maybe I deserved to be for not being able to save them. That is not how it works, Natalie said firmly. Childbirth is dangerous, it is no one's fault. And being alone forever is not a punishment you should give yourself. He met her eyes across the firelight and saw something there that made his heart skip. Natalie. I know, she whispered. I feel it too. Is that wrong? We barely know each other. I know you are brave, Kyle said slowly. I know you are strong and kind and stubborn as hell. I know you make me laugh for the first time in years. I know when I found you in that creek, something woke up in me that I thought was dead. Maybe that is enough to know. She leaned forward and so did he, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. We have all winter, Natalie said. We can figure this out. All winter, Kyle agreed. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world buried in white. Kyle and Natalie spent the day digging out paths to the barn and the woodshed, working side by side, their breath frosting in the air. When they came back inside, red-cheeked and laughing, covered in snow, they fell into each other's arms as naturally as breathing. The winter days passed, each one bringing them closer. Kyle showed Natalie how to shoot his rifle, teaching her to aim at tin cans lined up on the fence posts. She was a quick study, her eyes sharp, and he was impressed. She taught him to dance, humming waltzes she remembered from the rare parties the orphanage had hosted, and they whirled around the small cabin floor, clumsy and joyful. They kissed often, long, sweet kisses by the fire, but Kyle was careful to maintain propriety. He slept on the floor in a nest of blankets while Natalie took the bed, despite her protests that she should be the one on the floor. He was courting her, he realized, in his own rough way, and he wanted to do it right. Christmas came, and they made the best of it. Kyle had sugar and flour, and Natalie made cookies that filled the cabin with the smell of cinnamon. He carved her a small wooden bird, delicate and detailed, and her eyes shone with delight when she opened it on Christmas morning. It is a meadowlark, he explained. You said you wanted adventure, wanted to fly free. This seemed fitting. It is perfect. She kissed him, and the kiss deepened, became something more heated. Kyle pulled back reluctantly. Natalie, he struggled for words. I want to do this right. I want to marry you if you will have me, but I want you to be sure. I want you to have a choice. She cupped his face in her hands. Kyle Ramsey, I have never been more sure of anything. Yes, I will marry you. 1,000 times yes. They married in February, during a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow and made the 10-mile trip to Fargo possible. The local preacher married them in his small church, with his wife and another couple from town as witnesses. Natalie wore a simple blue dress the preacher's wife loaned her, and Kyle wore his only good suit, brushed free of dust and smelling of camphor. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kyle kissed his bride with a joy he had thought lost forever. They rode back to the ranch through the crisp winter air, Natalie sitting in front of Kyle on copper, his arms around her waist, both of them grinning like fools. That night, they truly became husband and wife, coming together in the firelight with tenderness and passion. Kyle had worried he might have forgotten how to be gentle, how to be a lover and not just a lonely man, but Natalie guided him with whispers and touches, and they learned each other's bodies with wonder and care. Afterward, lying tangled together under the quilts, Natalie traced patterns on his chest. I used to dream about this, she said softly. In the orphanage, all us girls would whisper about what it might be like to have a husband, a home, a real family. I never really believed it would happen for me. It is happening, Kyle said, pressing a kiss to her hair. You are mine now, and I am yours. This is real. Winter finally began to loosen its grip in March. The snow melted into rushing streams and green began to push through the brown earth. Kyle started planning for spring planting, talking about expanding the herd, building a bigger barn. Natalie listened and offered suggestions, and he was struck by how much she already knew about ranching after just a few months. One afternoon, they rode together to the spot where he had found her. The creek burbled cheerfully in its banks, showing no sign of the drama that had played out on its frozen surface. Natalie stood at the edge, looking down at the water. "I was so scared," she said. "So cold and alone, I thought I was going to die without ever really having lived." Kyle came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You are living now, we both are." She turned in his arms and kissed him. "Thank you for saving me, for giving me a home, a life, a love I never dreamed possible." "You saved me too," he said. "I was dead inside, just going through motions. You brought me back to life." In May, Natalie realized she was pregnant. She told Kyle one morning over breakfast, nervous and excited all at once. He let out a whoop of joy that startled the chickens outside, then lifted her up and spun her around the cabin. "Careful," she laughed. "I am carrying precious cargo now." He set her down gently, his hands cradling her still flat stomach. "A baby, our baby. Natalie, are you scared?" She understood what he was really asking, the ghost of Mary and his lost son hovering between them. "A little," she admitted. "But I am strong, and we will have a doctor this time. I will be fine, we will be fine." Kyle made the trip to Fargo that very day and arranged for the doctor to come out regularly to check on Natalie as her pregnancy progressed. Dr. Harrison was an older man with kind eyes and steady hands, and he assured them both that Natalie was healthy and showed no signs of the complications that had plagued Mary. The summer was busy with ranch work and preparations for the baby. Kyle built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until it was soft as silk. Natalie sewed tiny clothes from fabric she ordered from the general store in Fargo, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Her belly grew round and full, and Kyle loved to rest his hand there and feel the baby kick. Neighbors they had not met during the winter began to stop by as word spread of the new bride. The closest ranch belonged to the Patterson family, an older couple with 3 grown sons. Mrs. Patterson took an immediate liking to Natalie and brought her preserves and advice, both of which were gratefully received. "You landed yourself a good man," Mrs. Patterson told Natalie one afternoon while the two women sat on the porch shelling peas. "Kyle went through a dark time after he lost Mary. We all worried he would waste away out here alone. You are good for him." "He is good for me too," Natalie said, watching Kyle and Mr. Patterson mend a fence in the distance. "He saved my life in more ways than one." The baby came in January of 1879, almost exactly a year after Kyle had pulled Natalie from the frozen creek. The labor was long and hard, but Dr. Harrison was there, and so was Mrs. Patterson. And when it was over, they placed a squalling, healthy baby boy in Natalie's arms. Kyle wept when he held his son for the first time, all the grief and fear and joy of the past years pouring out of him. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you." They named him Samuel after Kyle's father. Samuel had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and he was the light of both their lives. Kyle proved to be a devoted father, pacing the floor during colicky nights, making silly faces to coax smiles, teaching his son to ride almost before he could walk. The years flowed by like the creek where their story had begun. Natalie did eventually get her chance to teach, starting a small school in their front room for the children of nearby ranchers. Kyle's herd grew, and he built the bigger barn he had dreamed of, and then added a second room to the cabin when their daughter Emma was born 2 years after Samuel. Emma had her father's brown eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, and she was a force of nature from the moment she could toddle around. Samuel was gentle and thoughtful, often found with his nose in a book, while Emma wanted to be outside with the cattle and horses. Kyle loved them both fiercely, marveling at each milestone, each small miracle on winter evenings when the children were asleep and the wind howled outside. Kyle and Natalie would sit by the fire just as they had that first winter. Sometimes they talked about their days, sharing small triumphs and frustrations. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the flames dance. "You ever think about what would have happened if I had not found you?" Kyle asked one such night. "Never," Natalie said firmly, "because you did find me, and everything that came after was meant to be." "You believe in fate. I believe in us," she said, turning to look at him. The years had been kind to both of them. Kyle had more silver in his hair now, and lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. But he was still the strong, steady man who had pulled her from death's grip. Natalie had filled out with motherhood, and her hands bore the calluses of hard work, but her eyes still sparkled with that same determination and joy. "I love you," Kyle said, "more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "I know," Natalie said, smiling. "You show me every day. In every kindness, every kiss, every moment you choose me and our family. I love you too, Kyle. Always." More children came. 2 more sons they named Thomas and Daniel, born in 1883 and 1886. The cabin grew into a proper house with multiple bedrooms and a real kitchen. The ranch prospered, and Kyle became known throughout Dakota territory as a fair dealer and a good neighbor. Natalie's school expanded too, and she eventually had 15 students, teaching them reading and writing and arithmetic in the room Kyle had built special for that purpose. Samuel grew tall and serious, with a gift for working with animals. He could gentle the wildest horse, nurse a sick calf back to health, and had his father's patience and kind heart. When he was 20, he married a sweet girl from town named Catherine, and they built their own home on the far end of the ranch. Emma became a teacher like her mother, but with a wanderlust that called her to new places. She taught in Montana for a few years, then in Wyoming, sending long letters home filled with adventures and observations. She eventually settled in Colorado, marrying a newspaper editor and writing articles about life in the West that were published all over the country. Thomas inherited the ranch when Kyle grew too old to manage it alone. He had his father's love of the land and his mother's sharp mind for business. Daniel became a lawyer, moving to Bismarck but visiting often, especially after he married and had children of his own. The years turned, and Kyle and Natalie grew old together. They sat on the porch in the summer evenings, watching grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played. They told stories of that first winter, of the blizzard and the Christmas cookies and the dancing in the small cabin. "You were so proper," Natalie would tease, "sleeping on the floor like a gentleman." "I was courting you," Kyle would reply with dignity, though his eyes twinkled. Had to do it right. In the spring of 1912, Kyle fell ill. He had been slowing down for a while, his joints stiff with age, his breath coming shorter. Natalie nursed him with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, but they both knew his time was coming. "I am not afraid," he told her one morning, holding her weathered hand in his. They were both in their 60s now, their hair white, their faces lined with the years. "I have lived a full life, a happy life, all because of you, because of us," Natalie corrected, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We saved each other, remember?" "I remember everything," Kyle said softly. "Every moment. It has been a beautiful life, Natalie. You made it beautiful." He died that afternoon with the spring sun streaming through the window and his wife's hand in his. Natalie held him and wept, grieving the loss even as she celebrated the gift of their years together. She lived another 8 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. She never remarried, telling anyone who asked that she had already had the love of her life. She continued teaching until she was too frail to stand at the blackboard, and she kept the ranch house exactly as it had been when Kyle was alive. On cold winter nights, she would sit by the fire with a quilt wrapped around her shoulders and remember. She would remember the feel of icy water and the terror of thinking she would die alone. She would remember strong arms lifting her to safety and a gruff voice telling her to hold on. She would remember learning to dance in a tiny cabin, learning to love again after a lifetime of loneliness, learning that home was not a place but a person. She would hold the wooden meadowlark Kyle had carved for her that first Christmas, its wings still spread in eternal flight, and she would smile when her time came, peacefully in her sleep on a snowy February morning in 1920. They buried her next to Kyle on the hill overlooking the ranch. Samuel and his sons carried the casket, while Emma read a poem about love and loss and the promise of spring. All of their children and grandchildren gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had been the heart of their family. Years later, when the great-grandchildren asked about the old ranch and the people who built it, they heard the story of the lonely cowboy and the woman he rescued from the ice. They heard about a love that bloomed in the hardest winter, that grew through seasons of joy and sorrow, that lasted until death and beyond. And on cold winter days when snow fell soft over the Dakota plains, it seemed you could almost see them, a man on horseback, his coat wrapped around the woman in his arms, riding toward home. Together, always together. The creek still ran past the old homestead, freezing solid in winter, babbling cheerfully in spring, eternal and unchanging. And if you stood there in January when the ice was thick and the air was sharp enough to cut, you might feel something in that place. Not sadness, though tragedy had touched there. Not fear, though death had come close. Hope. That was what lingered in that spot. Hope and the promise that even in the coldest, darkest moments rescue might come, that love might bloom where death had reached, that a chance meeting on a frozen creek could change everything. The old cabin, expanded and modified over the years, still stood in the 21st century, preserved by the family as a memorial. Tourists sometimes stopped to take pictures and read the plaque that told the basic facts. Kyle Ramsey, rancher. Natalie Turner Ramsey, teacher. Married 1879. Parents of 4, grandparents of 12, great-grandparents of 28. But facts could not capture the truth of it, the way two lonely souls had found each other in the wilderness. The way a single act of kindness had rippled out through generations, creating a legacy of love and family that endured long after both were gone. Their descendants still gathered every January at the old homestead, a tradition started by Emma and continued by her children and grandchildren. They would stand by the creek, even in the bitter cold, and toast Kyle and Natalie with hot cider. They would tell the story again, making sure the youngest children heard it, understood it, carried it forward, because it was a story worth telling. A story about rescue and refuge, about two people who had nothing finding everything in each other. About a woman who said she had nowhere else to go and a man who gave her a home. About a love that started with frozen water and desperate need and blossomed into something warm and enduring and real. In the end, that was the legacy Kyle and Natalie left behind. Not just a ranch or a name, though those mattered too, but proof that love could survive anything, could grow anywhere, could transform two broken people into something whole and beautiful. The wooden meadowlark Kyle had carved sat in a place of honor in the preserved cabin, behind glass now, protected from curious hands. Its wings were still spread wide, ready for flight, ready for adventure. And in its stillness, it held all the movement of their lives. The journey from loneliness to love, from winter to spring, from rescue to forever. That was how it ended, and how it began, and how it continued in the hearts and memories of everyone who knew their story. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple truth of two people choosing each other every day, through every season, until death parted them and love reunited them in whatever lay beyond. A lonely cowboy rescued a woman from the ice. She said she had nowhere else to go that winter, and he gave her not just a season but a lifetime, not just shelter but a home, not just survival but a reason to live. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.